Alrighty, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to let users log into your app using Google. And the way that that will look is like this. So first, the user clicks a login button. Second, they actually log into Google. And third, they actually get yeeted back to your app. And good stuff. Now the user is logged in, and your app has access to their basic data, not including passwords. As you saw, this implementation allows you to customize how your login button looks. It doesn't require an embedded Google button. This was very important for my application when I first learned Google authentication. The closest thing in the Google documentation that this method of Google login aligns with is called OpenID Connect, but I've basically personalized it just a little bit. If you prefer the blog version of this tutorial, that will be in the description below. My plan is to show you the minimal steps to get the open source repos that I've published running. Then I will explain the key points for understanding how everything works. But if it's already running and you already understand it all, then you won't even need me. That's efficiency, baby. Okay, to get started, clone the backend GitHub repo into some spot on your computer. If you don't know how to do this part, maybe pause this tutorial and learn how to use Git and command lines, you freaking noob. You can also just jump into the Discord and we will quickly teach you. Using either yarn or npm, install all the local packages. I use yarn. If you tried starting this app now, it would not work because we are in need of some environment variables. So, in the backend repo, create a file called .env that looks like this. You see that there are some values missing. Let's fix that. First, you see MongoDB URI. That is because this app stores user data using MongoDB. You can set up Google login without using a database, but it would use slightly different logic than in this tutorial. This user authentication system is more realistic. You'll probably never see one without a database in real-world applications. You have to store user data somehow. So the next step is to set up a free database in MongoDB. I'm skeptical if I should even show this part because it's just using their website in a basic manner, but I shall. Alright, so first things first, go to mongodb.com. Go ahead and log in or create a new account. I'm going to just log in with my test email. And I need to actually create a new account with this email, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Next thing you need to do is actually build a database. And you want to choose all the free options. So we're going with shared. Pretty much everything you see here, just leave it as default, unless you specifically would like to customize and explore. But I'm going to leave it default, and then click Create Cluster. So then it takes you here. And the next step is to create a username and password. I'm just going to say test user1. Going to auto-generate a password. I'm going to copy that. Paste that somewhere on my other monitor. Now you want to scroll down to here. You want to add your current IP address. And if you want to save yourself some trouble later on, for testing purposes, you may just want to allow all IP addresses. I've gotten stuck on that before, and yeah, it's kind of annoying. So you can actually allow all IP addresses by adding a certain value as an IP address. So if we go to the blog tutorial, somewhere in here, there it is. You can just take this, add that, and now this will make it so it accepts all IP addresses. After that, click Finish and Close. So then you want to go to your database deployments. Whatever this is, I'm not going to do it. So I'm gonna close. And then go to your cluster, press connect, go to connect using VS Code. And then here is your connection string. So copy that, go back to your env file and paste that in. You want to make sure that you replace this entire thing here, this template here, with your actual password for the user that you created. And that's it for setting up MongoDB. Although one last thing I would say is that if you actually want to see your data in the database, I recommend getting MongoDB Compass. It is incredibly valuable. For this JWT secret key, you can literally just use any value. And as you see right here, we need to set up Google to fill in the last two environment variables. All right, so go to console.cloud.google.com. Here, it's probably gonna make you create an account or something like that. And what you wanna do is make sure to create a project. So just go to new project. I'm just gonna leave it the default name and I'm gonna create it. Then you're probably gonna have to wait a little bit for it to create. And it's done. So now click on APIs and services. And if it actually prompts you to choose a project, then choose the one that you literally just created. All right, now on the left side, go to OAuth consent screen. You want to choose external, create it. Now fill out everything that is required. Everything's pretty obvious, but there are two things that I'll point out. So first, make sure to add these two non-sensitive scopes, email and profile. And second, add all emails that your app allows to log in the test user section. So if you want to test using some email, then add that email. Once that is done, go to the credentials tab right here. Create a credential, OAuth client ID. It's going to be a web application. I'm gonna leave that default. And there's really only one important thing here. So I'm going to go back to the blog tutorial and you want to copy this URI. And with it, you want to add it as a authorized redirect URI. So once you have that there, then create. After pressing create, you should now have your two environment variables. Paste those into the correct variables inside the .env file. All right, the backend is good. Now, clone the front-end repo, install local packages using npm or yarn, just like you did on the backend. Go ahead and create a file called .env.local. And inside of that file, simply add this right here. Now, do some prayers to the coding gods and run both applications. Start the backend first. I just press F5 on my computer to do this in VS Code. You will know if running the backend worked because you'll see database connected down at the bottom here. Then start the front end. I just use yarn dev to do this. Should be able to go to localhost 3000 in the browser and see something appear. Hopefully. So as you see, it's a basic page with a Google login button. Now test it out. The whole process works, then awesome. If it doesn't, double check everything covered prior to this, and always feel free to join the Discord and ask questions. So now I'm going to cover the key points for how this works. It's good to have something that runs, but you also need to understand how it works at least a little bit. I tend to think of applications starting from the user's perspective, but with the developer's understanding. The process that the user interacts with is a step-by-step process in code that can be understood. To start off, the user sees a Connect Google button. They click this button, which then calls a backend API endpoint. So if we go to the front end, and we find out where the onClick handler is, you'll see that it's actually inside of a component called auth status with connect button. And you see all that happens on click of that button, it calls a method called Google Login. This method is in a file called Google User Service. And what it does is it checks if the user is already logged in. If they are, do nothing. If they're not logged in, then call the backend using the initiate Google Login API method. When successful, this just returns a URL. This URL is where the user is taken in order to log in with Google. But let's pause a second and see what that method does on the backend. We see that the front end, if we go in here, see that the front end is calling this backend API endpoint inside of this method. So let's go to the backend and find this endpoint. So if you're looking for an endpoint, obviously the first thing you want to do is check out the routes. Specifically, let's go to the user token routes, since this is a user authentication system. And immediately we have found the endpoint. You see initiate Google Login. So let's actually check out the logic for it by looking in the initiate Google Login method here. So this is the controller, and that is what it's called at first. And then inside the controller, it calls the service method, which is this one. The service is typically where all the logic is. Let's check that out. So go to the initiate Google Login DB method, and you see this one's actually pretty simple. It's basically just one method being called. So let's see what this get Google auth URL method is doing. Well, there is some complexity to this. Like, it is important that the redirect URI is correct, but at the same time, this is pretty simple. It's just building the Google auth URL, just like the method name suggests. Then this URL is returned to the front end, and the user is taken to it so they can log in. Okay, but then what? This next part was where my understanding got stuck for a little bit. After the user finishes logging in, what happens, and how does your app know they logged in? Do you remember that redirect URI? It was defined in the Google console, which I no longer have open, but I can take a look at the blog tutorial. So it was defined in the Google console, and it looked like this. Remember, we just kind of pasted it in. And it was defined in get Google auth URL that we were just looking at. So if we go back to here, get Google auth URL, you see it's also defined right here. Well, this endpoint is where the logic continues after the user logs in. Google does a GET request to that backend endpoint defined as the redirect URI. So you need to have that endpoint created. And if you look in the user token routes that we were in earlier, you see right here that it is indeed defined. So let's look at the controller by checking out the complete Google login method right here. First thing in the controller, you see that the service method called complete Google login DB is called. You may have noticed something else. Google sends a code as a query parameter when they redirect you. Only way this could be sent is on successful login. So this code is pretty crucial. It is sent to the service method. So let's look at that logic. First, this method retrieves an ID token and an access token using the code from Google. If you look inside the getTokens method, it retrieves these two values by calling the Google API with the values needed. You guys can read, so I don't think I need to explain what you're seeing here. But going back to where the method is called, you see that once we have the ID token and the access token, you can use them to call another Google API endpoint in order to fetch user data, such as email, profile picture, and more. If no user data is found, then error out. And then, since we're using a database, either create a new user in the database or update that user data if it already exists. Next, generate an authentication token for the user using JSON Web Token. This is the user's important key that gives them access to do things on your app with that Google account. So make sure there's never any way that sketchy people can steal these tokens from users. I'm not a JWT expert. I almost never remember how to do this logic, but that's because I don't need to. You can literally just reference old projects or Google how to do it very quickly. So just know that this method right here generates a new JWT with the data that you pass into it. Also, never store passwords and extremely secure data in this payload here. I say this because these tokens can be easily decoded to get the payload data. Although, no one should ever get access to another user's authentication token in the first place, but still, just in case, don't store super important data in it. And after that, just return the auth token like so. So then execution returns back to the controller, and you see that here, we actually set a cookie that contains the authentication token returned from the service. This cookie will now be available to access on the front end. Also, I just want to note that this is an MVP example, and I know there's still some security issues here. For example, you'd probably want the 2 cookie flags to be true, but that's a whole other thing. However, overall, this is still pretty good. And the last thing that happens, the backend does a redirect to send the user to your front end URL, which is defined in the environment variables file. Once the user is redirected to the front end, they will now be signed in. They're signed in because their browser now has the auth token cookie. So I didn't show this part in the blog tutorial, but if you go to the browser, and if you're already logged in, so I'm going to do that real quick. Okay, so you see that I am logged in. We can go over here to application, and you can look at the cookies in your browser. And you see, here is the auth token cookie. If you don't know how to read the inspector, like the console, the elements, the application, the network tab, all of that's super important. Can't really do development without it, so yeah, definitely learn how to use this stuff. Sweet. So the last thing I will show you is how the user data even got on the front end to be displayed at all. With what we covered previously, I think you should be able to figure this out on your own, but I'll help out a little bit because maybe you're not super familiar with React. So going to the front end, open up the main app file right here. You will see that there is a global context component and a client wrapper. All global context does is allows you to create global variables that can be used anywhere in your app. For example, we open that component up, you see that we have 2 variables, one for the JWT and one for the user data. If you go to the client wrapper, you see it is setting the JWT using a method from global context. This is because the client wrapper is used to initialize the JWT and the user data on first load of the page. I don't want to get too in the weeds with this because I think it's pretty simple, but let's imagine a little user scenario. The user just logged in and was redirected back to the front end. Right when they make it to the front end, the use effect inside client wrapper is called, which then calls the method called init user data. This method gets the cookie that was set on the backend. If there was no cookie, then nothing happens and the user is not logged in. If there is a cookie, then the user is logged in and we need to fetch their user data from the backend to display it. So we call set user from JWT, which is defined in the useauth file. All this does is call the backend endpoint with the JWT that was fetched from the cookie. This then returns the user data, and now that data can be used on the front end. For the sake of keeping this shorter, I will not explain how the backend API for fetching that data works. It's a challenge that I bestow upon you. All of the code is there for you. But that's about it. Everything should be working, and users on your app should be able to log in using Google now. If you have any questions at all, hop in the Discord and we'll help you out in real time. Peace out and have a nice day.